Hi, welcome to HowtoDandD. My name is Fred Wheeler and today I want to talk about Dungeons & Dragons. Mostly I'm talking about Dungeons & Dragons 5e, but this can be applied to other versions of Dungeons & Dragons and possibly other types of role-play games if you're interested in that sort of thing. The topic for today is how to make your Halloween Dungeons & Dragons game session or Dungeons & Dragons scary. My biggest issue with doing a video on this topic is it's one of the most difficult things to do. So Dungeons & Dragons 5e in particular makes it difficult. So even though I will explain how to go about making and running your Dungeons & Dragons game session and making it scary, that's not going to make it easier for you because it is in fact incredibly difficult to do well and successfully. And it will take a lot of practice and you will have to use multiple techniques. So when I talk about the stuff in this video, don't focus on one aspect. You have to use the full package. If you don't use the full package, you really don't have a hope. It's just the truth as far as I'm concerned. I found it very difficult to do myself. It took a lot of practice. Okay, so number one, Dungeon Masters. I want you to slow down your description and your speech and the way that you talk. Now, don't go down so slow that the players are sort of waiting for the next word to come out. But often what I would do is I would say a short sentence and then allow for myself to breathe. I wouldn't rush through the description, and most of my descriptions and anything I said was very short. So I was looking at about maybe 2 or 3 very short sentences, and then I would stop. And I would speak in a slower pace or and cadence than normal. You'll notice that I'm kind of doing that right now, but that's still quite fast. You don't have to go down to a complete snail pace. That's the only thing I would say. Okay, all right, so next thing. Allow for pauses in your description. This creates tension. You still plan to actually speak and answer questions, but by pausing and waiting, you're forcing your players to listen, and also they're waiting for that answer. So pauses are good. They help create tension in the body, and therefore I encourage you to do so. It will also allow you time to breathe and suck in the air and to think, because one of the things you'll find when you're running a horror or a scary Dungeons & Dragons session is that you have to have time to process. Therefore, pauses are your friend, so use them. I know Dungeons & Dragons is very much a combat-focused game system, but you need to run less combat. One of the things that will wreak tension and really make it very difficult to make a Dungeons & Dragons adventure scary and horrific in any way is by running lots of combat. So you need to trim that back. Either trim it back or things that were going to be a combat scenario, turn them into something else, okay? Because it will wreck it. You're falling into the trap that most players will start to pursue, and that is, well, all I need to do is use my special class features and my race features and my spells, blast this monster or creature or whatever it is, or this threat, destroy it, knock down its hit points, and collect its treasure. And that's the last thing you want them to be thinking. So don't do that sort of thing if you can help it. One of my favourite movies in terms of horror is the original Blob movie with Steve McQueen. And one of the things that this illustrates is that make sure to present monsters that are much more powerful than the party can manage. Fear and balanced encounters suck for being scary and running a Halloween encounter or game session for Dungeons & Dragons. So make sure that the monster is far more powerful than the party. They can't just lay into it in a combat encounter or the first time they meet it and beat it. That's not going to work. Okay, so avoid that sort of thing. You need to present something far more powerful than the party. Don't avoid character death. Now, I don't mean go out of your way to kill characters, and I'm not talking about players, I'm talking about characters. but you don't want to avoid it. If it comes up, let it play out. Okay, what you've got to understand is the players' characters, they're not superheroes anymore. They are the victims. That's why when you watch a horror or a scary movie or read a scary story or a horror story of some kind, a lot of the main characters, whether they be classified as the main characters or minor characters such as an NPC or non-player character, a lot of them perish or die during that story. So try to understand that you want them to understand they are the victim now. They are not going to find this easy, so that's really important. Players need to sometimes know what they're going to do if their character dies. So I would have a discussion in session 0 or just before your session if you don't have time for a session, particularly if you're just doing a one-shot, because the worst thing you can do is have one of the player's characters die early on in your game session and they have nothing to do. So figure out what they're going to do, whether they're going to play another NPC that you have included in the adventure, or maybe their character will die but will continue to play in some way. And I've talked about how to do this many times before, character death options, but there's something horrible happening to their character, or their character is a ghost and therefore it can't do quite the same sort of things they were doing before. One of the worst things you can do when you're running a scary or horrific Dungeons and Dragons session is to have a high turnover of characters. So if a player winds up losing a character and that character dies and they bring in another character, then the fear of death is gone. So death is not the worst thing that can happen in Dungeons and Dragons and the session you're running for Halloween. Okay, that's what I want to make clear to you, that don't avoid it, but it's not the worst thing that you can do as a dungeon master when you're running the game. Death in Dungeons and Dragons is quite common, whether it be a player character, but usually it's the monsters that die quite easily. They're not usually sort of hard to kill or anything like that, and then of course the looting process continues. One of the good examples of how to make death in Dungeons and Dragons unusual and strange is the original Alien movie. Now, when it came out, the idea of something ripping through your chest that had infested you and basically was growing inside you was really quite horrible for a lot of people to watch. And it's one of the greatest alien horror scary movies out there. So I would highly recommend coming up with some unusual ways of dealing with how your NPCs and a player character might actually go about dying in your game should that come up. And by all means, you should definitely have some non-player characters who die. They are there as cannon fodder. And of course, there are lots of different ways of running a campaign or a one-shot for Halloween. But I would go with the unusual and the strange when it comes to any kind of death in your game. Alright, so the next aspect is, let's look at some of the ways that are really terrifying in terms of death in your game. There are ways that death can occur that make a big difference in increasing or rising the player tension. And there are 3 that I can think of right off the top of my head, 5 which I will provide. The first one is infestation. The Alien movie is a good example. Something infests you. The slard, that frog creature, that can infest you with a tadpole, and there's something growing inside you, and it's not easy to get rid of. Infestation could be something like rot grubs. There's lots of different things and creatures that do this sort of thing. So infestation is one of the worst ways because you can drag it out. It might be a long process that takes a while, or it might be a quick process depending on who's infested and how you want to play it out. Transformation. One of the best ways you can scare somebody is to use slow transformation. Something's occurred to a non-player character or a character and they're slowly transforming. Ultimately what it means is, it might not mean death, but it will be the erasing of their character's mind. Their personality, whatever makes them them, will be gone once this transformation is complete. So another way of dealing with that Impregnating, so something impregnates a non-player character or one of the characters within the story. And of course there's something growing inside. That's very much a lot like Infestation, very similar in nature, but the only difference is that it's done through other means, if you know what I mean. One of the scariest concepts that you can apply in your game is the idea of being fed on or eaten alive. Now you can do this slowly or quickly. I think I would go with quickly when it comes to a non-player character, and with your player characters you want to do it slow. So you're creating a ticking clock that's working against them. Okay. The other thing is you want to be gross. Use gruesome descriptions in terms of any kind of death that occurs or any kind of thing that is dead in your game, because there will be a lot of dead things in your game if you're running a Halloween scary session, right? Okay, so when it comes to horror movies, we're usually talking about evil, and one of the best tools that evil has is infiltration, deception, and disguise. That is evil's true horror and tool, so utilize it. There are lots of things that can disguise themselves. A mimic can disguise itself as something else. But there's a thing called the yokel. It's basically a dripping mass that's yellow with a single eye, and it can disguise itself as something else, such as a drow or maybe a barmaid. Nothing worse than suddenly deciding to bed down the barmaid and it's not actually a barmaid. That would be pretty horrific in terms of my interpretation of playing the game, and you can utilize that kind of concept in your own game if you wanted to. So remember, infiltration, deception, and disguise. Whatever evil or monster it is won't present itself straight away. It's going to throw them down the wrong pathway. It's going to possibly try to assist them, but they don't know that they're chasing something that's right beside them. All of those things make really good tie-ins to making a really scary and horrible Dungeons & Dragons adventure. Now, Hansel and Gretel had the right idea, and as a dungeon master you should be doing pretty much the same sort of thing. Make sure to leave tracks and trails and clues and signs that are unclear in the origin. So when they're trying to figure out what the mystery is, or you're having a sort of more of a thriller where there's a bit of investigation required, you're not too sure what's causing the loss of people in a village or town, there's a mystery to be unwound, and usually there is some sort of mystery or secret to be discerned in some sort of scary or horrible story, right? So make sure to leave clues, tracks, trails, things like that, and these don't necessarily have to steer a player in the right direction. I know a lot of people think, well, all of these things should be directing them towards the completion of the overall story arc, but I wouldn't necessarily do something like that. What you want to do is create molehills out of small, unimportant items and details through their senses. One of the things you'll find is your players will often catch on or latch on to a completely unimportant fact or item and think it has more significance than it really does, and therefore play to that. You can use sight, smell, touch, sound, even the lack of sound or the lack of sight. So putting them in a dark environment is often a really good way of trying to make things scary. Now the problem I find with Dungeons and Dragons is most players don't really feel that's a big issue, because guess what? They all have dark vision, because literally almost every single race seems to have dark vision. So darkness is not necessarily useful to you unless it's magical darkness. Then you have eliminated their ability to see what's going on. So now they've got to rely on things like smell and touch and sound, and that makes things a lot scarier. So utilize that as well. Try to fabricate fake threats to distract your players' characters from the real threat. What you want to do is like a magician. You present one thing, but there's actually something else going on behind your back or up your sleeve. So you're doing the same thing as your magician. You are presenting one thing, but in fact something else is taking place. Make sure to exploit your players' real fears, not the player's character's fears, but the actual player. If you have any kind of knowledge of what they are scared of, those are useful to you. Make sure you've got a good relationship with them before you start doing this sort of thing. You don't want to traumatize them. You don't want to wind up with them freaking out so much they wind up leaving your table. This is a good time to start focusing on reading body language. Remember, majority of communication is not done through speech. It is done through how you move, where you put your eyes, facial expressions. So focus on your player's body language to figure out what you can get away with and what you can't get away with. One of the most frightening and chilling stories is The Shining. Now there's a book, there's a movie, and if you've ever watched the movie or read the book, you'll know it is a pretty scary story. So there are lots of ways of doing this, and the designer, the person who wrote this story, understood how people think, and he doesn't have the benefit of body language, so you have a lot more resources at your disposal. Now I know people are going to say, yeah, but Fred, I didn't do psychology and I don't really know how to read body language. You've been doing it from the day dot when you were born. Okay, from the very time you were born as a little baby, you've been reading people's body language from there. You might not think that you're very good at it, but that's not true. You are an expert. Maybe not trained, but you are an expert. One of the worst things you can do is show the monster too soon. Don't show your monsters or creatures too soon to the player's characters. Try to draw it out as long as you can. As I said, darkness, but the unknown is what makes things really scary. And if anybody remembers watching the movie Jaws, what made that particular story and movie so frightening is the fact that you don't see the shark. You know there is a shark, there's something below the water, but we don't see the shark too much later on. And that's what you should be doing, is make sure to leave your monster very much to near the end of the game session, or just draw it out as long as you possibly can. That will certainly improve the chance of your players actually getting frightened and scared. And that's what we're going for. We're going for an emotional response. Okay, so horrible and scary monsters don't make a scary adventure. Just because you picked a particular monster out of the monster manual or from popular culture or from myth does not make your adventure scary. It could help, but it won't necessarily solve all of your problems. Now I'll explain to you part of the issue behind that. And you'll notice that I haven't shown you a lot of the traditional scary things for Halloween. I haven't shown you ghosts, I haven't shown you vampires, werewolves, scarecrows, pumpkin heads, things like that. I haven't shown you those sorts of things because we are desensitized to those sorts of things. We are very much used to them, and therefore they don't really pose much of a scare factor for us. And your players will be going through the same sort of thing. So you're going to do a couple of different things to ensure that you are generating surprise and fear, and that is change your monsters. Use monsters in your game that you don't normally use, and there are plenty of different options. You can change the way they look, you can change their stat blocks. If you're using an existing monster, say you decide I definitely want to use a zombie, change the zombie stat block so it doesn't have the same statistical information on it. The problem is that a lot of people remember how those monsters work, and for something to be scary and frightening you have to throw them a curveball. Okay, so the unexpected and the unknown, that's what truly makes something very, very frightening and scary. So change your monsters, change your stat blocks. When it comes to the main big bad villain or creature that you're going to present in your adventure, make your villain hard to kill. Make them hard to defeat, or have them come back. So killing them the first time didn't solve the problem. They need to seem invincible, certainly the first time that your players meet them with their characters. They are not invincible. Often what will take place with any kind of horror story or a scary story is that there's only a single factor or flaw that this monster or creature or villain has. And the players' characters are going to have to figure out what that flaw is to actually defeat the threat. And the Terminator movie is a good example. The burning robot. We see the burning robot. We see basically Arnold, he's driving the truck, he crashes after it's blown up, and there's a big ball of fire, and there's rubble, leftover bits from the truck, and we think that it's all over. The robot has been destroyed. The Terminator is gone. But then things move in the fire, and suddenly it reveals that there's no more flesh, and what was underneath, the true nature of this terrible threat, lies beneath the skin. You can use the same sort of concept in your own adventures when you're running Dungeons and Dragons. So the Terminator movie, I know a lot of people think it's an action movie, but the Terminator movie is a horror movie. And if you understand that, great. So what you're going to do is you're going to present a threat or villain who seems invincible, and they are going to have to figure out how to defeat this terrible threat. Okay, there are factors that come into play that are outside of your control, and without player buy-in, you are screwed. I hate to say it, that if you don't have players who want to be invested in the horror story and are showing up to play the murder hobo and kill monsters, and their first reaction is to get into combat and fight stuff and then take their stuff, it's probably not going to work very well. So make sure that you have a group of people who understand that they're playing in a horror story. And when I was running the Curse of Strahd, I explained to my players, look, don't expect me to be that nice, okay? Don't expect your character not to have some sort of horrible thing happen to them. Don't treat it like a normal Dungeons and Dragons vanilla adventure, because it's not. And so the same thing needs to apply when you're running your Halloween D&D session. Okay? The only way you need to get this to work is if you have player buy-in. Okay, so what do we do about some of the problematic behaviors that occur? Well, I'm going to talk about one only, simply because some of the other ones you just can't stop. Like I said, you're screwed if they just start doing that sort of thing. But if players use jokes, go off topic, make sort of side remarks, and you can tell they're really not immersed into the adventure and the story you're trying to tell, there's really nothing you can do to fix that. What you can try and do to alleviate the problem is this. Try to treat all of their jokes and off-topic comments as actual character dialogue in your adventure, no matter how ridiculous and stupid and out of the whole realm of your story and how out of character it seems. Just respond to everything as if they talked in character and let it play out. What I'm trying to get you to do is, even if the players are going to break character and break the tension, don't let yourself go out of character. Stay in character the whole time, okay? And a lot of people will say, okay, so one of the greatest things you should do is add in dark humor or humor to break up the tension. That only is useful if you're running a very long session. And a better way to deal with that is actually to take a break rather than to use humor, because then you've got to circumvent what you've just done. You've just broken down what you've done, and then now you've got to build in another aspect to it that means you have to build up that tension again. So I suggest taking a break rather than using dark humor to sort of alleviate tension when you can see that the players are getting a bit tired. Okay, so don't break character, stay in character the whole time. What about some of the easy ways of dealing with making something scary and frightening? There are 3 different things that people will talk to you about, which you can use. They are easy, they're not hard to do, you can do them. They do have some sort of effect on your game, but I will tell you now, they are not the most effective ways of developing that tension in your player. And that is to use low light in your game room. So turn down the lights. The problem with doing this is you can't read. So if you've got old eyes and you have trouble seeing the page and the print, that'll create a whole lot of other problems. So that means setting up candles and dimming the lights is all very well, but sometimes it doesn't work. But certainly that does help in terms of creating the mood. A lot of people will use music. I've used music before, and the right type of music as atmosphere in the background is great. You just have to be careful about how loud the music is, and you might find you need to be able to control the music volume. So there'll be times when you want to turn up the music, and other times when you want to turn it right down, particularly when you're trying to describe something or there's a lot of people talking. I know for me, since I have hearing damage, that if there's too many different sounds and noise going and taking place in a room, I can't decipher anything that's being said. So it can work, it can be very effective, but it will only work for some people. It doesn't work with everybody. Okay, so the last thing, if you're a particularly unusual dungeon master, really sick dungeon masters will go to extremes, which means they'll go and muck around with the air conditioning and turn the room temperature down. You can do this. That will certainly make your players colder and help build tension, because their body is trying to push blood through the veins to the rest of their limbs as you're freezing them to death. But yeah, and that certainly will help build tension and make your adventure scary. Those three techniques: low light, music, and dropping the room temperature. You can dress up your environment with props and so forth, but honestly, all of the other things that I talked about are far more useful to you when you're trying to be scary. What I want to make clear to everybody is that what you're essentially doing is, because Dungeons and Dragons is a mechanical game, it's very much a mechanical game, and you can take some of the mechanics out to make it a bit easier to run a scary or horrific adventure. What you're essentially trying to go for is when you're sitting around the campfire and you're telling ghost stories. Now, I'm sure you remember doing this as a kid, and you would sit around and you would tell ghost stories, and everybody was trying to scare and frighten everybody else, and we would tell stories about all sorts of things. It might be a ghost, it might be mad people who went off and did all sorts of horrible things to people. I remember the story that I remember the most is somebody who escaped from a mental asylum and took somebody's head off and was banging it on the roof of somebody's car. So those are the sorts of stories that we used to tell. So when you come to doing your dungeon mastering for this, try to think about, I'm sitting at the campfire, I've got the fire going, it's dark, it's late, and everybody's sort of wrapping up, trying to stay warm, and I'm telling a ghost story. That's essentially what you're trying to do. Now, if you found this useful, fantastic. I actually have many videos on the Curse of Strahd for the Dungeon Master if you're interested. Lots of additional advice on how to play the game for players and Dungeon Masters if you are interested as well. If you want to support the channel so I keep doing content like this, I have a Patreon page where you get access to the unlisted live streams and additional content that I make, and priority on the videos that I make as well. I also have a affiliate link to the book depository and Amazon down in the description. I get a small commission, you pay the same price. And I have a merchandise shelf under all of my videos as well if you want some merch. Make sure to share, like, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to be notified when I go live and when I publish new videos. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.